The hunt begins across the cold plains of Kareth 9. The sky burned orange with twin suns and the air smelled of metal and fear. The noble hunters of the Jock Empire laughed as they released their beasts from the cages. The sound of claws on sand echoed like drums of arrogance. They hunted for sport, and this time their prey were the forgotten refugees of the fallen frontier. Among the trembling survivors hid a young alien mechanic named Kale. His hands were stained with grease, his eyes wide, with disbelief as he saw through the scope of his broken scanner that no help was coming. The distress calls had gone unanswered for months, because no one dared to cross Jock territory, but Kale sent one anyway. It was a blind pulse thrown into the void powered by the last battery cell he had. He whispered into the mic, "If anyone can hear us, they are hunting the weak. They call it sport, but it is slaughter. Please, if anyone is left who remembers mercy, answer." And then he closed his eyes, expecting silence. Hours passed, the hunters came closer, and the wind carried their cruel songs until the ground shook. Not from their ships, but from something smaller, faster, sharper. A single vessel broke through the clouds. It was black with silver markings, and the name burned faintly on the hull. Starborn Aria Vale stood on its bridge, her uniform plain, her voice calm. She looked at the readings and said, "We found them. Prepare for dust descent." She had seen many hunts before during the war, years, and she knew the pattern. Arrogance always blinded those who thought others were prey. The corvette dived through plasma trails and landed between the hunters and the refugees. The Jacques nobles froze. They had never seen a human ship. Not in living memory. They thought humanity had vanished after the fall of Sol Prime. Aria stepped down without armor, only a sidearm. Her eyes locked on the lead noble, who smiled and said, "Human, you step into a hunt you cannot win." She replied, "I do not play games with lives," and she raised her hand. The ground mines she had dropped during descent pulsed blue, and the hunter transports powered down in perfect silence. Kale watched from behind a ruined crawler as the hunters stumbled backward. The humans moved with quiet coordination. No shouting, no chaos. Every motion like a line of thought turned into muscle. They rescued the children, first patched the wounded, and marked every fallen body with a small white beacon. Later, Kale learned those beacons, transmitted names so no one would ever be lost without memory again. When the last transport fled, Aria stood in the wind, her eyes scanning the horizon. She asked Kale who had sent the distress call. Kale hesitated and pointed at his small broken device. She smiled faintly and said, "Then you just saved your people because someone has to start the signal." The young mechanic followed her to the corvette and for the first time saw what humans had become. Inside the ship, everything was precise, and alive corridors glowed with soft light. Crew spoke little, their faces marked by fatigue but not cruelty. Aria told Kale they once promised the galaxy they would stay away after the war, but promises break when monsters start hunting the innocent. Again, Kale asked why humans were helping when everyone else had forgotten. She replied, "Because we remember what it felt like to be hunted." Outside, the survivors were being loaded onto shuttles, and the horizon shimmered with the heat of escaping. Raider engines, Aria's second officer, reported that the Jacques fleet would regroup soon and bring heavier fire. She only nodded and said, "Let them. We will teach them what real hunting means. But not today. Today we save lives. Tomorrow, we hunt the hunters." Kale looked out the viewport. As the corvette lifted through the dust clouds, he saw the burned plains below, littered with the wrecks of predator drones and broken claws of beasts. He realized that the myths were wrong. Humans had not vanished. They had evolved into something else, something that learned how to turn fear into discipline and pain into strength. Far beyond Kareth 9, the message spread through shadow networks, whispers of humans returning not as prey, but as the apex predators, who walked quietly until provoked across the trade lanes. Merchants whispered the old warnings again. When you hear thunder in clear skies, it is not a storm. It is them. It is the Starborn. And as the corvette vanished into jump light, Aria Vale closed her eyes and whispered to the stars, "Hunt season is over. Ghosts in the brush." The stars drifted past like cold fire as the Starborn corvette glided through silent space. its engines tuned low to hide from scanners. Cale sat by the observation window. His reflection faint over the emptiness below them slept hundreds of rescued refugees, their breathing a quiet rhythm against the hum of the ship. Arya Vale stood beside him, her hands behind her back, her eyes fixed on the distant streaks of radar. "Patrols scanning for their prey," she said softly. "They call themselves hunters because they have never met prey. That could think back." Kyle looked at her uncertain. If it was pride or sorrow in her tone, she turned away and ordered a quiet burn to the next sector. The ship entered the dust field of Juno's graveyard, a region filled with shattered asteroids and old war debris. Arya ordered the crew to cut power to minimal and move manually through the fragments. Cale followed her through the narrow maintenance corridors, watching how each crew member worked without needing commands. One gesture, one look, and they understood he had seen soldiers before. They moved like chaos. These humans moved like breath. Later that night, Kyle sat with the crew in the galley and listened to their stories. They were not warriors born. They were survivors of fallen colonies, engineers, medics, and pilots who had built themselves into a fleet that carried no flag but a promise they called themselves Starborn, because they had no homeworld, only each other. Every world they saved became their proof that humanity still mattered in a galaxy that wished it forgotten. Meanwhile, far away, the Jacques nobles were humiliated, their hunting fleet crippled, by a single corvette they called Emergency Council, with their patron Lord Sarath, a member of the Galactic Council, who ruled through fear and spectacle. Sarath's voice slithered through the hologram like oil. He ordered the nobles to continue the hunts, but to change the rules. Humans were now worth triple points, dead or alive. The nobles cheered at the thought of redemption. They did not realize that the moment they made humans prey, they marked their own extinction. Back aboard the Starborn, Arya began studying the radar patterns. She had Cale assist her, because his local knowledge could reveal their logic together. They mapped the hunting zones across the outer systems. The routes were predictable circles of cruelty. Arya smiled faintly at the pattern and said, "They think like sport, not strategy." She leaned closer to the console and began marking ambush points. Cale asked what she planned. She replied, "We will use their own rules against them. We will not just stop the hunt. We will end their pride." For days, the corvette moved unseen through the Badlands, deploying drones that whispered false signals and baited the raiders into traps instead of killing them. Arya ordered capture. She wanted the nobles alive to spread fear when they realized who had caught them. The prisoners trembled when they saw humans in plain armor with no insignia. Their voices broke as they begged for mercy, but the Starborn gave them food, water, and clean beds. It confused them more than pain ever. Could one noble asked, "Why are you helping me?" Arya simply said so. "You will live to tell others what real strength looks like." Kyle began to understand the power in restraint. Every decision Arya made carried weight not of vengeance, but of message. She was teaching the galaxy through action that mercy itself could become a weapon, and fear would bloom not from death, but from the certainty that humans were beyond simple cruelty. In the next cycle, the Starborn intercepted a raider convoy disguised. As traders, Cale joined the boarding team. His heart pounding as they cut through the hull. The corridor smelled of oil and blood, but no one fired. The raiders surrendered without resistance. They had seen what happened to those who fought humans. A captured helmet from the convoy showed encrypted council symbols. Arya studied the code and her expression darkened. She said softly, "This goes higher than we thought. Someone in the council is feeding them for profit." Kyle asked if she would reveal. She shook her head. Not yet. Truth must strike when the world is watching, otherwise it dies unheard. That night, Cale found her standing alone by the viewport, the stars reflecting in her eyes. She told him that long ago, before the fleet, she had lost a sister to a similar hunt, and every mission she led was her way of rewriting that memory. Cale felt something shift inside him, respect turning to belief. He realized that humans were not just fighting for revenge. They were fighting to ensure no one else lived through what they did. Outside in the void, silent sensors flickered. Unknown contacts appeared, small, fast-moving in disciplined formation. Arya's lips curved into a knowing half-smile. She whispered, "So the wolves are coming then. To her crew, she said quietly, "Keep the lights low and heart steady. Tomorrow the hunters become hunted." As the Corvette slid into the dark and the ghosts of humanity prepared their next move, Kyle understood the truth humanity had not returned for. Conquest. They had returned because they were done running. And across the galaxy, whispers began to grow louder. Stories of invisible ships, stories of mercy sharper than any blade, stories of ghosts in the brush who moved like shadows and struck. Like storms, the hunters laughed in disbelief, but somewhere deep in their bones, a cold instinct awoke, the instinct that told them the apex had returned. First blood on open ground. The red sun of Vornus Delta rose over a cracked horizon and painted the sky in burning haze. The hunters had gathered again in their grand arena. Wide plains surrounded by jagged stone and old metal ruins. It was to be their greatest spectacle, a final hunt that would erase their shame from Kareth 9. Noble ships hovered above with banners streaming and slaves released below to run as prey. The crowd of raiders cheered through open comms. They wanted blood and glory, unaware that the ghosts they mocked had already set the field long before the games began. Aria Vale stood on the ridge overlooking the arena, her Corvette hidden beneath a cloaking shroud. The ground was seeded with mines shaped like natural. Rock's drones lay silent under dust, waiting for her signal. Kyle crouched beside her, his heart pounding as he watched the raider armada take positions. He asked her how many ships were there. She replied, "Enough to believe they are safe. Not enough to stop what comes next." Her voice was calm, but every word carried weight. She raised a hand, and the Starborn emblem shimmered faintly on her wrist, transmitting a code across the fleet unseen to all others. Far above, in the shadows of the moons, several smaller Starborn ships waited, their engines muted like beasts before the leap. They were not massive dreadnoughts, but fast, precise, and deadly, trained to fight without collateral. The humans had learned from every war that victory meant control, not chaos. Aria's orders came without emotion. The teams moved in patterns that painted death as if it were art in the plains below. The raiders released their mechanical hounds, sleek machines with spiked limbs designed to hunt heat signatures. They tore through the dust, sniffing for movement, and soon found terrified refugees running between the rocks. Kale gritted his teeth, wanting to rush down, but Arya stopped him. She said, "Patience is not weakness. It is the edge of the knife." And then she pressed the command key. The field erupted in silent light. Mines did not explode. They emitted a shock pulse that froze the hounds mid-step and fried their circuits one by one. They fell without sound, their glowing eyes fading to gray. The raiders above shouted in confusion, thinking it was a system failure before realizing it was precision sabotage. Moments later, the drones under the dust came alive, launching nets of plasma filaments that wrapped around the raider scouts, pulling them to the ground before they could scream. Arya watched the chaos unfold and gave the second order. From the shadows came the Starborn ships, fast and clean. They struck like blades through air, disabling engines, not destroying them, capturing rather than burning their restraint. More terrifying than slaughter, Kale saw through his binoculars. The nobles screaming to retreat while humans walked through smoke, marking survivors with tracking beacons and guiding refugees toward extraction zones. When one of the nobles aimed his cannon toward a fleeing child, Arya moved faster than thought. She launched her Corvette downward through the dust clouds. Engines roaring, for the first time her ship struck the cannon turret with a precision blast, tearing it clean without detonating the entire hull. She stood on the bridge, eyes hard as stone, and ordered open link to all frequencies. Her voice rang across the channels. "This hunt ends now. Anyone who fires again will not have time to regret it." The silence that followed was heavy like gravity. The raiders hesitated, then one desperate noble opened fire. His missiles streaked through the sky, but they never reached the target. Small interceptor drones detonated mid-air, intercepting every projectile with perfect timing. The explosion lit the clouds and the echo carried across the plains. The noble ship shuddered and fell, its systems locked by a Starborn hack. The human Corvette circled, once, then released a flare of white light, marking the end of the battle. Kyle ran through the ruins, helping civilians board the shuttles, his hands shaking not from fear but from disbelief. He had just watched humans dismantle an entire hunting fleet without killing more than a handful of raiders. He turned to Arya and said, "They will call you monsters for this." she replied. They already did long before they knew what monsters truly were. As night fell, the remaining raider ships scattered, leaving their banners burning in the dust. Arya ordered the crew to collect every recording. Kale's footage would be transmitted across border worlds, so all could see the truth of what had happened when the Starborn returned. No words, no propaganda, only raw proof that humans were no longer the hunted in the quiet after the storm. Kale looked up at the stars and felt something shift in the air, as if the universe itself held its breath. He could almost hear it, the whisper running through the void, spreading like fire. They fought back, they fought, and they won. He turned to Arya and asked what would happen next. She looked toward the sky where the last raider signal faded and said, "Now the real hunters will come." And somewhere deep within the Galactic Council chambers, alarms began to sound as hidden. Networks detected the rise of human transmissions for the first time in centuries. The galaxy knew the apex had drawn blood, and the hunt had just changed sides. The Council's mask. The halls of the Galactic Council glimmered under cold white light, their walls filled with voices that pretended to care about peace while feeding war in the shadows. Lord Sarath sat in his grand chair, his eyes reflecting holographic screens filled with reports from Vornis Delta, his raider fleets humiliated by a single human corvette. His hand tightened around his glass of dark wine until it cracked. The aides around him spoke nervously, saying the situation was a misunderstanding, that humans were using illegal technology, that they must be sanctioned before the border world start believing the old myths again. Sarath smiled with false calm and whispered to himself, "Humans have returned. Let us remind them who writes the rules." Back in the border sectors, the Starborn corvette rested in the orbit of a half-ruined colony world. Kyle and Arya worked side by side, repairing local shield towers with scavenged metal and worn tools around them. Villagers watched silently, still afraid to speak to the strangers who had saved them. Arya moved like someone who had done this 1,000 times, each action deliberate. She repaired not just machines, but trust. Kyle could see it, every gesture, every word, soft enough to calm, yet firm enough to lead. One evening, as the suns fell below the mountains, a sleek silver ship appeared in orbit, its transponder flashing the insignia of the Galactic Council. Arya ordered the shields lowered, but kept weapons charged. The envoy vessel descended, and from it stepped 3 officials in polished robes. They smiled with teeth too white and voices too smooth. The leader introduced himself as Envoy Trell. Speaking on behalf of Lord Sarath, he thanked Arya for her bravery, then accused her of destabilizing Council peace operations. Arya listened without expression. Kale could feel the tension in the air, like a storm about to break. Trell said humanity's presence was unauthorized, their weapons illegal, their interference a violation of interstellar law. He demanded immediate surrender of all captured raider vessels and access to the Starborn's command codes. Arya replied in a tone calm enough to cut steel. She said, "Your council funds these hunts, you call them games. Your hands are dirtier than the raiders you pretend to condemn." Trell's smile faltered only for a moment. Then he leaned forward and said, "You have no evidence and no allies." She looked him in the eye and said, "Yet here we are standing on a world you abandoned." The envoy left. But Kale knew the conversation had changed everything. That night, Arya gathered her crew and told them the council would not stop at words. She expected sabotage and attack, something subtle and cruel. They strengthened patrols, checked every code twice, but still it came. A week later, a supply shuttle exploded inside the hangar, killing 2 engineers. The shield grid failed moments later, leaving the colony exposed. Panic erupted as the villagers screamed, thinking the raiders had returned. Arya rushed to the control deck, her voice steady as she commanded reroute power through secondary lines, seal the breaches, and prepare evac routes. Kale worked beside her, hands shaking from adrenaline. He saw fear in the eyes of people around him, but in Arya's gaze there was only focus. When the shield came back online, she exhaled once, then whispered, "Someone wanted this to happen." She went through the logs line by line until she found the trace, a council encryption pattern buried deep inside the supply manifest. It was proof the sabotage was staged by Sarath himself. Kale asked if she would send it to the galaxy. She shook her head. Not yet, not until the right moment. That night, Kale found her alone at the edge of the canyon where the colony lights shimmered below. She told him about a colony she once served on during the Silent Wars. She had begged for council aid for weeks, but none came. The raiders arrived first, and her sister died on the third day. Ever since then, she swore never to wait for permission to save lives. Kale realized then that her calm was not born from control but from loss turned into purpose. As dawn rose, smoke still hung over the colony. But people had begun rebuilding again alongside Starborn crew members. Children carried tools instead of weapons. Arya watched them silently, then turned to Kale and said, "We cannot fight them by the blade alone. We must expose them by truth and timing." She uploaded encrypted evidence of council funding routes to a dozen safe relays and instructed Kale to guard the final key if something happened to her. Later that day, the envoy ship returned, but this time it carried more than diplomats beneath its hull. Hid strike drones painted with council colors. Trell smiled again on the comm and said, "The council appreciates your cooperation." Captain Vale Arya's eyes narrowed. She whispered quietly to her crew, shields up. "Prepare for contact." Kale watched as the sunlight glinted off the enemy drones like steel insects rising from the horizon. He realized the council had removed its mask and now showed its real face. The Starborn crew moved without panic, systems coming alive with purpose engines flaring as they rose above the colony. Arya looked once toward the planet and said to Kale, "If they want a hunt, we will give them one. They will not like how it ends." As the corvette climbed into the sky and the enemy closed in, Kale felt a chill run through him. Not of fear, but of certainty. The war that had been whispered across worlds was now beginning in open sight. And this time, it was not the humans who would run Starborn doctrine. The horizon of the colony burned red as council strike drones filled the air. Their wings slicing the morning light into shards of fear, the villagers ran for shelter, while the Starborn corvette rose through the smoke, its engines humming low like the sound of a heart ready for war. Kyle stood by the viewport, his hands trembling, but not from panic, rather from the weight of what was coming. Arya Vale stood on the bridge, her posture steady, her voice calm. She looked at the drones circling above and said, "Let them come. It is time they learned what the word Starborn truly means." The first volley hit the shields like a hammer against glass. The corvette shook but did not break. Systems flickered for a moment, then stabilized. Arya gave short commands, her crew moving like living extensions of her will. They did not shout. They did not rush. Every motion was rhythm, pure and efficient. Kale realized this was not battle. It was music, and every note was survival area. Ordered defensive drones to launch, they burst from the ship in waves tiny and bright, weaving among the enemy machines with precision instead of exploding. They disabled power cores and guidance chips, rendering the council weapons blind and harmless. One by one, the drones fell like metal rain over the plains below. The people looked up in awe, thinking it was some kind of miracle. Kyle whispered, "How do you win without killing?" Arya answered, "Because we fight to end hunts, not to start new ones." The council fleet retreated for the moment. Regrouping beyond the moon's edge, Arya used the pause to contact her hidden relays across the border sectors. She activated a phrase known only to Starborn officers, a phrase that had not been spoken in decades. When it echoed through the comms, every distant ship bearing the mark of Saul stirred from silence and moved. The call of the Starborn had gone out across the void, and the galaxy would remember it. Hours later, the sky filled with shadows of approaching ships, but these were not enemies. They were sleek vessels painted dark gray and silver, flying in tight formation, each marked by the same faint star emblem. The Starborn fleet had arrived not with drums of war, but with the hum of purpose. They spread across the system, landing relief pods, repairing damaged colonies, opening water plants, and setting up med tents. Children stared wide-eyed at the soldiers who moved among them, speaking softly, offering food and bandages, not orders or threats. Kyle watched in disbelief as the humans rebuilt faster than the council could destroy. He asked Arya why they worked so hard when the war had just begun. She told him, "Because every act of creation is a weapon sharper than destruction, because the moment we rebuild what they tried to erase, we win something greater than territory. We win belief." While the people healed, the council transmitted its propaganda to the nearby worlds, calling humans savages and terrorists, showing edited footage of battles and burning ships. But Cale knew the truth. He had seen it with his own eyes, and so had hundreds of others. The refugees broadcast their own stories across public channels, telling of the hunts, the rescues, and the quiet courage of those who never fired unless forced. Soon the council's lies began to fracture, as more witnesses spoke the truth. The image of humanity changed once again, from myth to warning. Arya received intelligence that Sarath had ordered a full blockade of the border systems. The council wanted to trap the Starborn fleet before the evidence of their crimes spread further. She stood in the command chamber, her face pale, but her eyes burning. She said, "We will break the blockade without killing if possible. But if they force our hand, we will not hesitate." She turned to Cale and handed him a small data core inside. It was the compiled proof of every hunt, every payment, every council order that had funded the cruelty. She told him, "If I fall, you must deliver this to the free colonies. Promise me." Cale hesitated, but then nodded with silent determination. As the blockade ships appeared on long-range scans, Arya ordered her fleet into formation. Not a wall of fire, but a dance of light and speed. The Starborn vessels began their maneuvers, splitting into ribbons of motion, weaving through each other in calculated patterns. Cale could hardly breathe as he watched the display, every ship moving like it shared one mind. When the council fleet opened fire, the humans did not meet it head-on. Instead, they flowed around the attack, their smaller ships diving between energy beams, cutting enemy reactors with targeted pulses that shut down engines without killing crews. The blockade began to crumble. Not in blood, but in confusion. Arya's plan was working, but it came at a cost. Several Starborn ships took heavy damage. One of them, carrying her closest friend, Commander Lyra, was hit directly. Cale watched the explosion through the viewport and saw the light fade. Arya said nothing, only closed her eyes for one heartbeat, then whispered, "Continue the mission." When the final blockade ship powered down, the Starborn fleet held the corridor open for evacuation transports. Thousands of civilians escaped. Through the path of light carved by human hands, Cale stood in the hangar watching them leave, knowing that this victory would be temporary but symbolic. The galaxy now knew that the council could bleed, and that the Apex were no longer myths. As the fleet regrouped, Arya stood by the command console, her voice soft yet unbreakable. She said, "We will not rule. We will not conquer. We will remind them that mercy can be stronger than fear." Cale looked at her and understood the doctrine that guided the Starborn. They were not hunters of flesh. They were hunters of cruelty, and wherever cruelty rose, they would follow. Like the quiet storm that never needed thunder to be feared, and far beyond the stars, Lord Sarath watched from his council chamber, his hands trembling for the first time as he whispered to his aides, "Find them, find her before the myth becomes truth." The breaking point. The black of space stretched endless as the shattered blockade ships drifted among the stars, and the Starborn fleet hovered silent around them like guardians of judgment. Arya Vale stood at the command platform of her flagship, her hands clasped behind her back, her face illuminated by the soft glow of tactical screens. Reports came in from every corner, of the fleet repair crews working without sleep, medics treating the wounded. Cale stood beside her, reading transmission logs from allied colonies. More worlds were declaring neutrality, refusing to send tribute to the Galactic Council. It was working. The truth was spreading. But Arya knew victory never came without a shadow following close behind. Lord Sarath had retreated to his hidden fortress in the heart of the Council's core systems. There he had unleashed his elite squadrons, soldiers, bred for control. Their ships were massive, angular things designed to frighten rather than fight. The order was clear: destroy the Starborn fleet and capture Arya Vale alive. He wanted her as proof that humanity could still kneel. His advisors warned him that such pride had ended empires before, but Sarath laughed, saying, "This is not war. This is pest control." On the border of the Orion Reach, the calm before the storm was broken by the shriek of incoming warnings. The Starborn sensors flared red, thousands of enemy ships emerging from jump tunnels, their formation precise, their weapons glowing. Arya studied the readings, her heart steady, her voice. Even she said, "They have come at last." Kyle felt the chill in her tone. It was not fear. It was acceptance. She turned to her officers and said, "This is not the battle we want, but it is the one we will remember." The first wave struck like fire across water. The fleet split into ribbons of light following Arya's command patterns. Each vessel, weaving between plasma bursts, returning fire only to disable, not destroy their speed and coordination, baffled the enemy who had prepared for brute warfare, not precision combat. Kale watched through the observation deck as human ships moved like living veins of light pulsing through the void, their weapons cutting engines, not lives, their shields absorbing the weight of hatred and giving back only clarity. But the Council squadrons had numbers on their side, and slowly they began pushing forward. One Starborn ship was caught in a crossfire, its engines tearing apart in a white bloom of energy. The shockwave rattled the fleet, and Arya's second-in-command shouted that they needed to fall back. She refused and said, "Hold the corridor. Civilians are still evacuating through the third gate. We will not abandon them again." Her voice rose just enough to be heard across the bridge. She said, "They think strength means domination. We will teach them that it means protection." Hours passed like centuries, every second a storm of motion. Kale moved between stations, helping relay codes, his arms burned from exhaustion. But he refused to stop. He saw faces of young pilots, their eyes hollow, but filled with faith. One by one, they reported hits taken, systems failing, and still they fought. Arya's ship was struck twice, power flickered, but she never left her post. Even when shrapnel sliced her shoulder, she simply wrapped a band around it and continued issuing orders. Then came the moment no one wanted. One of the lead Starborn frigates carrying the evac convoy was disabled, drifting toward the gravity well of a nearby moon. If it fell, it would drag hundreds of civilians with it. Arya looked at the readings and said, "Send our tugs to intercept." Her officer protested, saying the enemy line was too thick. She answered, "Then we cut a hole." She ordered all attack wings to converge and open fire in a spiral pattern. The fleet obeyed, their ships diving through plasma, storms carving through enemy formation with such precision that even the Council admirals paused in disbelief. The corridor opened just long enough for the tugs to pull the frigate clear, but at a cost. Commander Lyra's successor, Lieutenant Mara, took a direct hit during the maneuver. Her ship burned silent and cold. Kale watched it vanish and saw Arya's face tighten. Her voice cracked only slightly as she said, "Seal the line and continue evacuation." Kale realized that every loss weighed on her like a personal wound, yet she refused to let the grief stop her. When the last evac ship cleared the system, Arya finally gave the order. All units disengage and vanish. The Starborn fleet broke formation, scattering into dozens of invisible signatures, disappearing into dust clouds and asteroid belts. The Council ships tried to follow, but could not, their scanners confused by jamming signals left behind. Arya's flagship was the last to vanish, leaving behind only silence and drifting. Rex hours later, aboard the quiet bridge, Kale delivered the final data broadcast to Allied worlds, revealing the Council's secret funding records and Lord Serath's personal authorization of the hunts. The message echoed across the galaxy, world by world, station by station. The lie-fractured people rose in protest. Soldiers refused orders, entire fleets stood down rather than fire on civilians. Arya watched the reports come in, her face pale and weary, but her eyes finally softened. She said softly, "Sometimes breaking the chain hurts more than wearing it, but it must be done." Lord Serath raged when he heard the transmissions. He struck his table until his hand bled, shouting that humanity would drown in their own mercy. But the tide had already turned. His own guards hesitated when he barked orders, their loyalty shaken by the truth. As the Starborn regrouped in a distant nebula, the wounded ships formed a rough circle around the flagship. Medics moved through corridors, treating survivors. Arya stood before the viewport and Kale joined her. She whispered, "We held the line long enough, that is what matters." Kale looked at her and said, "They will come again." She nodded. "But when they do, they will find a galaxy that no longer believes their lies." The quiet hum of the ship filled the silence as stars drifted slowly past outside, each one reflecting in Arya's eyes like embers of a long night waiting to end. She turned away and said, "Prepare for the final move. We are not finished until the hunters themselves are unmasked." Apex. The sun over Vornus Prime burned gold through the smoke of wreckage as the final chapter of the hunt began. The Starborn fleet had regrouped near the border, rim wounded but unbroken. Their ships moved with silent precision, forming a shield around the last convoy of civilians fleeing the war. Arya Vale stood on the command bridge of her flagship. Her uniform torn, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion, yet her voice calm. She stared at the tactical display, showing dozens of raider ships charging toward them under Council command, and said, "This is where it ends. Not because we are stronger, but because we remember who we are." Kale sat at the console beside her, his hands shaking as he tracked the incoming waves of hostiles. The enemy formation was chaotic. Desperate, the Council had lost control, and now Serath's raiders sought to destroy everything before their power vanished. Arya ordered defensive drones to deploy in a spiral net formation, turning the fleet into a moving wall of energy. The sky filled with light as ships clashed, beams lancing through the void and debris scattering like embers in a storm. Inside the chaos, the Starborn fleet moved as one, their smaller ships weaving through enemy fire, covering each other. Their strategy no longer defense but precision counterattack. Arya gave quick, sharp commands, her tone never rising above a whisper, yet every pilot heard it as a vow. Kale felt his fear dissolve into focus. He understood now why they called her the Ghost Captain. Her calm was not detachment, it was the eye of a storm that refused to close. The enemy's main cruiser broke through the line and aimed straight at the flagship, its cannons glowing blue with overcharged plasma. Kale shouted warning, but Arya had already seen it. She ordered forward thrusters and ram intercept. The ship lurched forward. The impact shook the deck, the hull groaning as metal tore. The explosion filled the viewport with white light. When the glare faded, the raider cruiser drifted powerless, its weapons melted from feedback. Arya steadied herself against the railing. Her lips bloodied from the hit and said, "Send boarding teams. I want Serath's courier alive." Kale volunteered to join. The team, their shuttle cut across burning wreckage and latched onto the crippled cruiser. Corridors inside were filled with smoke and broken bodies. The raiders were fighting among themselves, desperate to escape. Kale and the Starborn soldiers pushed forward until they reached the command core where the courier ship waited. Ready to launch, they breached the hatch and found a trembling figure trying to destroy a data core. Kale tackled him and pinned him to the floor. It was the same saboteur who had caused the shield collapse back on the colony. The man looked up, eyes hollow, and said, "I did what I had to. My family would have died if I refused." Kale hesitated, lowering his weapon. Arya entered behind him, silent and cold. She looked at the saboteur and said, "You have one chance to make it right." He stared at her as if seeing judgment itself, then handed her the drive. The proof of every order, every payment, every lie signed by Lord Serath. Before he could speak again, an explosion ripped through the corridor. Kale grabbed him, pulling him clear. The man coughed once and whispered, "Tell them I repaid it," before the flames swallowed the room. They returned to the flagship with the data. Arya uploaded it to every open channel in the sector. Her voice transmitted across thousands of receivers. "This is Captain Arya Vale of the Starborn Fleet. These are the records of the Council hunts, the evidence of those who funded them, the names of those who profited from the suffering of the innocent. If justice means anything in this galaxy, let it begin now." The message spread like wildfire within hours. The core worlds erupted, protests, riots, soldiers turning on commanders. Serath's name became a curse whispered in fear on his fortress world. Serath watched the broadcast, his empire collapsing around him, his guards refusing orders, his ships deserting one by one. He raged and screamed that he would rebuild the hunts. But his words echoed in empty halls. He fled toward his escape shuttle. But before he could reach it, the Starborn fleet dropped from jump space above his planet, their ships shining like falling stars. Arya gave one simple command: disable the throne, not the people. The bombardment was surgical precise, every fortress, every weapons depot erased without touching the cities. When it ended, Serath's rule was gone, and his world free. Days later, the galaxy entered a silence that felt like rebirth. New alliances formed across the border sectors, old enemies spoke of peace, and for the first time in centuries, humanity was not spoken of as ghosts or prey, but as guardians. The apex, not because they conquered, but because they endured. Kale stood on the observation deck watching the refugees from dozens of species, working together, rebuilding towns and planting crops under the guidance of Starborn engineers. He turned to Arya and asked, "What now?" "Captain," she smiled faintly and said, "Now we stop running, we teach them to live without fear. Because that is the only hunt worth winning. The Starborn fleet prepared to leave their ships shimmering in the dawn light. Arya looked one last time at the planet below, the people waving up at the sky. She whispered to herself, no crowns, no empires, only the promise that no one will ever be hunted again. Kale heard her words and felt a warmth rise in his chest, as if the stars themselves approved as the fleet jumped to the next frontier. The trails of their engines stretched like lines of fire across the night sky, and throughout the galaxy a new legend began to spread. They hunted humans for sport. But when the apex returned, the hunters learned the oldest law of all. When you chase monsters too long, you meet something greater, the quiet mercy of those who remember what it means to be human. When the apex stood tall, the void shimmered with distant stars as the Starborn fleet drifted above the border worlds, its hulls gleaming with the quiet authority of a promise-kept. Arya Vale stood on the bridge, her hands resting lightly on the railing, her eyes scanning the planets below where survivors rebuilt homes and cleared the scars of war. Kale stood beside her, watching children of different species playing together, unaware of the terror they had escaped. The air carried a strange stillness that felt heavier than any battle, but lighter than relief. Reports came in from every corner of the galaxy. Fleets had stopped their march, rebellions spread through council ranks, and the council itself had fractured. Sirath was nowhere to be found. Whispers said he fled to the outer rim, hoping to hide from the inevitability that had already begun. Arya did not celebrate. She only straightened her shoulders and said the galaxy will remember what mercy looks like. Kale asked if humanity would stay forever as guardians, she said. Perhaps not forever, but long enough to remind them that strength is not measured by how many you can crush, but by how many you protect. The fleet moved in silent formation, weaving between moons and debris, their engines humming low like the heartbeat of a living thing. Kale marveled at the grace of it. The Starborn pilots were quiet, but every maneuver spoke volumes. Every turn and spin communicated readiness and precision. The humans had become legends without claiming them. Their doctrine was etched into the fabric of the galaxy, without a single proclamation. Except the evidence of their actions, Arya called for a final meeting in the observation hall of the flagship. Her officers gathered around consoles and screens, all fatigued yet unbroken. She looked at each of them and said, "We leave behind more than survivors. We leave lessons. We leave proof that cruelty has limits, that the apex is not born from dominance, but from the courage to act when no one else will." Kale felt his chest tighten. He understood then why the Starborn were feared, not because of firepower, but because of what they chose to protect. They watched as small ships delivered food and medicine to worlds that had been abandoned. For decades, the Starborn fleet provided guidance to rebuild bridges, clear trade routes, and reconnect shattered communications. Their presence was quiet, a shadow that did not interfere unnecessarily, yet always there when needed. The galaxy began to whisper stories of humans who arrived without war and left without taking anything but hope. On the command deck, Arya handed Kale the final data core holding records of council corruption and every hunt that had been stopped. She said, "Carry it to the free colonies, make sure the truth is never buried." Kale nodded. He realized the weight of the responsibility, yet also the beauty of the trust she placed in him. The core was not just evidence. It was a reminder that the apex had a conscience and the power to enforce it without cruelty. As the fleet prepared to jump to unknown sectors, Arya looked one last time at Vornus Prime, the survivors waving from below the sun, catching their faces in gold light. She whispered softly to herself, "The hunters have learned now. They will think twice before chasing fear." Kale turned to watch her profile and saw in her eyes both sorrow and triumph, the kind of triumph that does not celebrate blood, but the survival of life. The engines flared and the fleet disappeared into jump space, leaving trails of light stretching across the cosmos like a promise etched in the stars. Civilizations would tell tales of the Starborn, of the humans who returned not to conquer, but to remind the galaxy that when innocence is threatened, the apex will rise, and those who prey will find themselves hunted in ways they never imagined. And in the silence that followed across the worlds that had known fear, the legend began to grow. Whispers turned to stories. Stories to songs, and songs to oaths. The Starborn became a name that carried weight even in the farthest reaches of space, a reminder that humanity is not prey, but protector, and that mercy wielded with strength is the greatest power of all. The end.